The Daily Wave. Officer Charlie Brick's boots clacked rhythmically against the cracked pavement, a steady and predictable sound that seemed to echo through the quiet neighborhood. It was just another early morning on patrol. The same route, the same routine. The sun had barely risen, and the chill of dawn still lingered in the air, tugging at his jacket. Charlie adjusted his cap, pulling it down a bit to shield his eyes from the low-hanging rays. As he walked, his thoughts drifted, his mind zoning in and out of the mundane details of his work. But there was one thing that always stood out amidst the monotony: the sight of a little girl at her window every morning, waiting for him. Ashley. She was always there, perched on the second-floor windowsill of a small, faded house on the corner of 5th Street and Oak. At precisely 7:30 a.m., she would appear with her trademark grin, her tiny hand raised in a wave that was full of unbridled enthusiasm. For the 4-year-old girl, it was just another daily habit, one she had no idea would touch the heart of the grizzled, world-weary officer who passed by. But for Charlie, it was more than a casual exchange. It was the moment of connection he had come to cherish during his long shifts. Every day, as he approached her house, a warmth would fill his chest. He'd slow his pace, watching as Ashley's eyes lit up when she spotted him. He'd raise his hand in response, mirroring her wave, a small yet meaningful gesture of acknowledgement. It was simple, no words exchanged, just the shared understanding of two people acknowledging each other's presence in a world that often seemed too busy to notice. "Morning, Ashley," Charlie would often mutter to himself, his voice soft, as if the little girl could hear him. Sometimes he even added a quiet chuckle, amused by the girl's constant energy and the innocence she exuded. She didn't know it, but her waves had become the highlight of his otherwise uneventful patrols. Over time, it had become something of a ritual. Charlie would look forward to the moment when he reached the corner, knowing Ashley would be there with her bright eyes, her crooked smile, her hand outstretched in that innocent greeting. To him, it was like a spark of light in a world that often felt dim. His job as a police officer, while important, could be draining. He dealt with cases of crime, domestic violence, and despair, stories of pain and heartbreak that seemed never-ending. And while he had a deep sense of duty to protect the community, it often left him feeling disconnected, as if he were just one small part of a much larger machine, moving through a world that didn't always appreciate the work he did. But then, there was Ashley. Her presence at that window was a constant. No matter how difficult his day was, no matter what kind of case he was dealing with, he could always count on her. There was something so pure about it, the simplicity of a child waving at a cop on his beat, as though they were old friends. Charlie didn't have children of his own. He wasn't even married. But every time he saw Ashley, he felt a connection, as if the innocence she radiated reminded him of the humanity he sometimes felt slipping away in his line of work. He couldn't help but admire how unaffected she seemed by the world around her. She was so young, yet she always seemed to greet him with such optimism, as though she believed the world was still a good place. Charlie often wondered how she saw him, if she recognized the uniform as a symbol of protection, or if she simply saw him as another person passing by. He hoped it was the former, that she saw him as someone who made the world safer, as a hero of sorts. But that day, something felt different. As Charlie neared the corner where Ashley's house stood, he scanned the usual spot where he expected to see her face, eager to exchange their daily wave. But there was nothing. No little hand pressed against the window, no smiling face peering out from behind the curtains. Just an empty window and the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze. A strange knot tightened in Charlie's stomach. His feet slowed, almost as if instinctively. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. The usual sense of warmth and connection that filled him every time he passed by Ashley's house was gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. He glanced around, searching the street, hoping to spot her running out the door any second. But there was nothing. Charlie frowned and tugged at his cap. Maybe she was just late today. Maybe something had come up, something simple. It wasn't uncommon for kids to be delayed. But still, the feeling of unease gnawed at him, a strange sense of worry rising up within him that he couldn't shake. As he continued his patrol, the usual rhythmic sound of his boots on the pavement now felt louder, more pronounced in the silence that seemed to have settled over the neighborhood. He found himself glancing back over his shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ashley's small face at the window, her hand raised in greeting. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of an ordinary street, the hum of distant traffic, and the quiet morning air that no longer felt so comforting. Charlie pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was overreacting. Kids miss a day now and then. Maybe she had stayed home from preschool or was preoccupied with something else. But despite his attempts to brush it off, the nagging feeling in his gut didn't go away. It only grew stronger, like a cloud hanging over him, threatening to rain. The next block came and went, and Charlie's attention remained distracted, his thoughts drifting back to Ashley. There had been a change in her eyes the last few days, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. She seemed quieter than usual. Not that he had ever spoken much with her. After all, she was just a little girl, but there was something in the way she waved, something that felt different. She didn't seem quite as energetic. Her usual gap-toothed grin, so wide and bright, had faded into a smaller, more subdued version. And the sparkle in her eyes, the one that had always shone so brightly, seemed dimmer, as if something had stolen that light away from her. Maybe he was just imagining things, Charlie reasoned. After all, he was just a cop passing by. He wasn't a therapist, and he wasn't privy to the struggles of the families in his patrol zone. Yet still, he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. By the time he reached the next intersection, Charlie had made up his mind. He would finish his patrol, but he would return here after his shift. He needed to know if Ashley was okay, if something had happened to her or her family. It was just a gut feeling, but Charlie trusted his instincts. He always had. He pulled out his radio and checked in with dispatch, his voice steady, but his thoughts still scattered. As he finished his report, his eyes subconsciously drifted toward Ashley's house once more, but the windows were still closed. The street remained as quiet as ever. It wasn't like her to miss a day. Charlie couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach anymore. He would check in on her. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. He knew it was just a little wave every day, just a child's innocent greeting. But to him, it meant so much more. It was a daily reminder that despite everything else, there was still good in the world. And if something had happened to Ashley, he wouldn't just walk away. He would find out what was wrong and make sure she was safe. With resolve in his heart, Charlie set his sights on Ashley's house again, his steps more deliberate, more purposeful. Something told him that today would be different. The unexpected visit. The day stretched on for Charlie. But no matter where he went or what he did, his thoughts kept circling back to the empty window. Every time his patrol route brought him past Ashley's house, he found his eyes flicking up, half expecting to see her at her usual spot. But the silence of the house seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment, and the gnawing worry in his chest refused to let go. His shift finally came to an end. The streets quieted as the morning gave way to the dull hum of the afternoon, the sky painted with streaks of gold and blue. Charlie drove back to the station and parked his patrol car with a heavy sigh. His fellow officers were busy filing reports or grabbing a coffee, but Charlie wasn't interested in the usual chatter. He had one thing on his mind: Ashley. After changing into civilian clothes, Charlie decided to head straight to her house. He hadn't planned on doing so, but the worry gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't just let it go. Something didn't sit right, and it was becoming harder to ignore. He found the address in his notes from previous patrols and drove down the familiar streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. As he neared the corner of 5th and Oak, he slowed, scanning the neighborhood. The area was peaceful, quiet houses with well-maintained lawns, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. Nothing unusual. But the closer he got to Ashley's house, the more the tightness in his chest grew. Charlie parked across the street from the house. His eyes were drawn immediately to the second-floor window, the one where Ashley always waved. But once again, it was vacant. No little face pressed up against the glass. No wave. He sat there for a moment, his gaze lingering on the house. He had no real reason to be here. After all, he was just a cop. She was just a child. But something about the absence today felt so out of place. Every day for months, that same wave, that same smile, had been a silent part of his routine. And now it was gone. Charlie grabbed the flashlight from his glove box and stepped out of the car. His boots crunched against the gravel driveway as he walked toward the front door, the weight of his uncertainty making each step feel heavier. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say. Was he overstepping his bounds? Was it appropriate for him, a police officer, to show up unannounced at a family's home simply because a child didn't wave one morning? His hand hovered over the doorknob. He hesitated for a moment before finally knocking. 3 quick raps against the door, the sound sharp and unfamiliar in the quiet afternoon. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity, as Charlie shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his thoughts racing. What would he do if someone answered? What would he say? After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Charlie was met by a woman, early 30s, dressed casually, her expression one of mild surprise as she glanced up at him. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes, although tired, held a warmth that made Charlie feel slightly more at ease. "Yes?" she asked, her voice hesitant but polite. "Good afternoon, Mom," Charlie began, trying to maintain a professional tone. "My name is Officer Charlie Brick, and I'm just checking in. I patrol this neighborhood regularly, and I couldn't help but notice your daughter wasn't at her window today. Is everything all right?" The woman's brow furrowed slightly, and Charlie saw a flicker of something cross her face. Concern, perhaps, or unease. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, glancing toward the interior of the house before stepping aside, opening the door wider. "I'm sorry to worry you," she said, her voice softer now. "But come on in. I think we should talk." Charlie followed her inside, stepping over the threshold into the modest home. The front hallway was dim, lit by a few small lamps scattered around the rooms. The scent of something baking lingered in the air, perhaps cookies or something sweet. The sound of a soft hum echoed from the kitchen, suggesting a calm atmosphere within the house, despite the tension in the air. The woman led him to a small living room, and Charlie could hear the faint sound of children's cartoons playing in the background. A few toys were scattered across the floor, and a half-filled coffee cup sat on the table. It all seemed so normal, so ordinary. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the couch across from her. Charlie nodded and sat down, feeling out of place. She took a moment, glancing down at the floor, her fingers nervously playing with a thread of her sweater. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I'm sorry about Ashley," she said. "She wasn't at the window today because she's not feeling well. She's been under the weather for the past couple of days, actually. It's been hard on her. I didn't mean for you to worry, but I suppose you could say I wasn't expecting you to come knocking like this." Charlie's heart lurched in his chest. Under the weather didn't quite explain the sense of dread that had been building in him all morning. He swallowed, trying to keep his composure. "Is she okay? I've noticed she's seemed different lately. More tired, not as energetic." The woman's face tightened. She took a deep breath, then looked Charlie straight in the eye. "Ashley has been struggling with more than just a cold. It's been harder for her to get out of bed, harder to smile. I didn't want to say anything, but..." She paused. "Ashley has leukemia." The words hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. He felt his breath catch, his mind struggling to process the information. Leukemia. But She was just a little girl, 4 years old, a child who had always waved at him, full of life and joy. How could something so cruel be happening to her? Charlie didn't know how to respond. He simply stared at the woman, at a loss for words. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I had no idea." The woman nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want people to feel sorry for her. I wanted her to have as much of a normal life as possible, even with everything going on." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "But honestly, it's been hard. She's been through chemotherapy, but the doctors say it's not enough. They've run out of options. The treatment isn't working the way they hoped." Charlie sat there in stunned silence, his mind reeling. He couldn't fathom the weight of what this little girl and her mother were going through. The image of Ashley's face at the window flashed in his mind again, her sparkling eyes, her innocent smile. And it broke his heart. He looked at the woman again, her face etched with exhaustion, but her love for her daughter shining through the cracks of her sorrow. "I'm sorry to come by like this," Charlie said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I don't know. I couldn't stop thinking about her." The woman gave him a small, weary smile. "Thank you for caring," she said. "That means more than you know." Charlie stood up, his legs unsteady as he made his way to the door. He turned back to give her one last look before he stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face as he left the house. His mind was spinning, his heart heavy with the realization that the little girl who had brightened his mornings was fighting a battle he had never imagined. As he walked back to his car, Charlie couldn't help but think of how precious life was, how fragile, how, in an instant, everything could change. And as he drove away, the world around him seemed quieter than ever, the weight of the woman's words still hanging in the air. Ashley's fight had only just begun. The silent struggle. The following days were a blur for Charlie. The weight of what he had learned about Ashley's illness loomed over him like a cloud, dark and heavy. It was hard to shake the image of her mother's face, the quiet sorrow in her eyes, and the helplessness she tried so desperately to hide. Charlie found himself constantly thinking about the little girl who, only a few days ago, had brightened his daily patrols with her innocent wave. Now, he couldn't help but imagine the pain she was enduring in silence. The next morning, Charlie made his way through the familiar streets once again. It felt like everything had changed, yet the world around him seemed to remain exactly the same. He passed by Ashley's house without slowing his pace, but the ache in his chest was unbearable. He had come to realize that he was no longer just a cop in this neighborhood. He had become a silent witness to a family struggle, and there was nothing he could do to make it better. He tried to go about his day, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Ashley, to the mother who was fighting a battle of her own, with no one to lean on. Charlie had seen people in pain before, but this was different. This wasn't a fleeting moment of struggle. It was a relentless, suffocating fight for a child's life. Each day, Charlie continued his patrols, passing by Ashley's house. He didn't stop anymore, but every time he drove by, he couldn't help but glance up at the window. The absence of the little girl's smile haunted him. He had begun to think about ways to help, but nothing felt like it could make a real difference. What could he do? He was just a cop, just a stranger passing through. What could he offer that would ease the pain of a mother watching her child suffer? Then, one evening after a particularly long shift, Charlie found himself driving toward Ashley's house once more. It wasn't part of his routine. He wasn't on duty. But he couldn't help it. The thought of her, of the struggle she was facing, gnawed at him constantly. This time, he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to stop, but something deep inside him told him he couldn't ignore it any longer. As he parked across the street, Charlie looked at the house with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know what he was going to say when he rang the doorbell, but he knew he couldn't just keep driving by. He had to at least try to do something, even if it was small. After all, what was the point of his badge and uniform if he couldn't use them to make a difference in someone's life, even if it was just one person? He took a deep breath and got out of the car. This time, when he approached the door, he didn't hesitate. The woman, Ashley's mother, answered, her face a mixture of surprise and exhaustion when she saw him standing there. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and Charlie could tell that the weight of the situation was starting to show. Her eyes were tired, and there was a heaviness to her step as she opened the door. "Officer Brick," she said softly, "what can I do for you?" Charlie shifted on his feet, unsure of how to begin. I just wanted to check in. To see how Ashley is doing." Her face softened at the mention of her daughter, but Charlie could see the guarded look in her eyes. The same look he had seen when she had first told him about Ashley's illness. It was the look of someone who had learned to shield their vulnerability from the world. Someone who was tired of being asked the same painful questions. "She's doing okay," the woman said, her voice quieter now. "We're taking things day by day." Charlie nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "I can't imagine what you're going through," he said quietly. "But I wanted you to know, if you ever need anything at all, I'm here. I'm more than just a cop on patrol. I can help in any way I can." The woman's eyes flickered with surprise, and for a moment, Charlie thought he saw a glimmer of something, perhaps hope or gratitude. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the exhaustion that seemed to define her every move. She stepped aside and motioned for Charlie to come inside. "I appreciate that, Officer Brick. Really," she said, her voice small. "But I don't think there's much anyone can do right now. It's just hard, you know." Charlie followed her inside, his eyes scanning the small living room, which had been rearranged to make room for medical equipment. There were IV bags hanging from a stand by the couch, and a soft oxygen mask lay on the coffee table. The faint scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the scent of cookies that had been freshly baked, an odd contrast to the heaviness in the room. Ashley was lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her small frame looking fragile and frail. She was awake, but her eyes were dull, far from the bright, energetic spark Charlie had once seen in her. Her hair, once thick and full, had thinned out due to the chemotherapy treatments. The sight of her like this hit Charlie harder than he had expected. The girl who used to wave at him from the window, full of life and joy, was now a shell of the child she had once been. Ashley's mother followed his gaze, her expression softening with both love and sorrow. "She's a fighter," she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. "But it's been so hard on her. And on all of us, really. I don't know how to make it better." Charlie stood there, unsure of what to say. Words felt useless in the face of such pain. He had seen grief, even desperation, in his line of work before, but this was different. This wasn't just a case to be solved. It was a life that was slipping away, despite every effort, every prayer. "I'm really sorry," he said, his voice low. I can't even begin to imagine what this is like for you." Ashley's mother gave him a tight smile. "Thank you. Honestly, you being here means a lot. Most people don't even want to talk about it. They think it's too sad, or they're afraid to ask. But we're all going through it, and it's nice to know someone cares." Charlie stood there for a few moments longer, lost in thought. He wanted to do more. He wanted to offer something concrete, something that could help. But he had no answers. He wasn't a doctor, and he didn't have the means to pay for expensive treatments or medical bills. All he could offer was his presence, his willingness to listen, but even that felt so small in the face of Ashley's battle. Finally, he turned to Ashley's mother, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I know this doesn't change anything, but I can check in. I can help with anything around the house. It might not be much, but you don't have to do it all alone. I'm here if you need me." She gave him a long look, searching his face for sincerity. Then she nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Officer Brick." That means more than you know. As Charlie left the house that evening, the weight of everything he had seen and heard settled in his bones. His mind swirled with thoughts of Ashley, her struggles, and the family's quiet fight. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't take away the pain. But for the first time in days, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference, no matter how small it seemed. And so, as he got back into his car, Charlie resolved to return every day if necessary, not just as a police officer, but as a friend, a small flicker of light in the darkness, offering whatever comfort he could in the face of an overwhelming storm. The hidden strength. Days turned into weeks, and Charlie found himself drawn into Ashley's world more than ever. What began as a casual visit during his off hours had transformed into something deeper, something that went beyond his role as a police officer. It was as though he had been invited into a world that was hidden from everyone else, a world of quiet, unspoken pain and unrelenting strength. Charlie had made it a habit to stop by Ashley's house every evening after his shift. Sometimes it was just to check in. Other times it was to lend a hand with house chores, or simply to sit with Ashley's mother while they watched her daughter sleep. Charlie could never bring himself to go in and disturb her. The fragile girl who used to be so full of life was now barely recognizable in her sickly, thin form. He could see the toll the treatments were taking on her body, how the chemotherapy had stripped her of her energy, her vibrancy, her spirit. But despite it all, Ashley fought. Every day, she fought in ways that no one could truly understand unless they witnessed it firsthand. She would smile weakly when Charlie came by, her eyes brightening just a little, like a flicker of light in a darkened room. But the moments when that spark of joy appeared were fewer now. Her mother, too, was a fighter. The woman had an unshakable resolve, a strength that Charlie had come to admire deeply. She never complained. She never cried in front of him. Even when the weight of her daughter's condition seemed too heavy to bear, she carried it with quiet dignity, as though somehow trying to protect Charlie from the full gravity of their situation. She had become someone Charlie admired more than he cared to admit. There was something almost otherworldly about her resilience. One evening, after Charlie had finished a particularly difficult shift, he decided to stop by a little earlier than usual. As he parked outside the house, he saw Ashley's mother sitting on the porch, her face turned toward the setting sun. Her expression was one of weariness, but there was peace there too, a kind of calm that only came after months of relentless struggle. He got out of the car and approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," Charlie said, offering a quiet smile. "How's it going today?" She glanced up, her eyes crinkling at the edges as she returned the smile. There was a touch of gratitude there, but Charlie could tell that she was just as worn as the last time he saw her. She hadn't had a full night of sleep in weeks. "It's been a good day," she replied, her voice calm but soft. Ashley had some moments of energy, which is always a good sign. It's hard to get used to the good days and the bad days blending together, you know. Some days she's stronger. Some days she's not. But we take it one day at a time. Charlie nodded, taking a seat beside her on the porch steps. "I can't even imagine what that must be like," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'm glad there's a little light in the dark." "Yeah," she murmured. "It's always there, even if it's just for a moment." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The world around them seemed to slow down, as though the gravity of their lives was too much for the everyday bustle to handle. Charlie's mind drifted to the moments when he had first started patrolling this neighborhood, how he had never once thought that he would find himself in a situation like this. He had signed up to protect people from criminals, not to witness the heart-wrenching battles of families like Ashley's. But here he was, and there was no going back. "I've been thinking," Charlie said, breaking the silence. "I know there's not much I can do to change anything, but if there's ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." The woman looked over at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a faint flicker of hope. "I appreciate that, more than you know," she said. "But sometimes, it feels like I'm asking for help too much. I don't want to burden anyone else with our problems. This is my fight, and it's hard enough as it is." Charlie shook his head. "You're not burdening anyone. You don't have to fight this alone." There was a long pause as she seemed to weigh his words. Finally, she exhaled slowly and gave a small nod. Maybe it would help to talk sometimes. Just about anything. Not the illness, not the doctors, but just life. I think it's easy to forget that there's more to life than just the battle we're facing. I can't always be strong, and it would be nice to just breathe for a little while. Charlie felt his heart tighten at her vulnerability. It was a rare moment, seeing this strong woman who had carried so much for so long, admitting that she too was tired. He reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the most comforting smile he could muster. "I'm here for you," he said softly. "Whatever you need. You're not alone in this." She nodded, her eyes a little glassy, but the weight of her words settled in her heart. She had been carrying so much on her own for so long that to finally let someone in felt like a gift. Over the next few weeks, their routine remained much the same. Charlie checked in every evening, helping with small tasks around the house, or just sitting with Ashley's mother, offering the quiet companionship she so desperately needed. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small piece of normalcy in a life that had been completely upended by sickness and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Ashley's condition continued to worsen. The once bright-eyed girl was now spending more time in bed, her body weakened by the chemotherapy. Some days, she couldn't get out of bed at all, too exhausted even to lift her head. Other days, she'd have brief bursts of energy, when she would sit up and try to play with the toys on her nightstand, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Charlie felt the crushing weight of helplessness each time he saw her. He couldn't save her. He couldn't fix it. No matter how many times he checked in, no matter how many times he offered his support, he could never undo the damage the disease had done. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the pain, but he knew that there was nothing he could do, and that feeling, the feeling of being so powerless, was the hardest part of all. One night, when Charlie arrived at the house, he found the door slightly ajar. It was unusual. The family had always kept the door locked. His heart skipped a beat as he quickly stepped inside, calling out softly, "Ashley, Mrs. Thompson." The house was eerily quiet. He moved cautiously through the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. As he entered the living room, he saw Ashley's mother sitting on the couch, her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with the silent sobs that she had been holding back for so long. Charlie's stomach sank. He walked over slowly, sitting beside her and waiting for her to look up. When she finally did, her eyes were red and puffy, but there was a relief there too, a sense of exhaustion, of finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what she had been going through. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's getting harder, watching her like this. I'm so tired." Charlie didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, his heart breaking for her. There were no words that could heal the pain. There was no fix for what they were going through. But Charlie knew one thing. He wasn't going anywhere. No matter how dark it got, he was staying. He was going to be there, every step of the way, for as long as they needed him. Finally, he spoke softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'm not going anywhere either. You're not alone in this." The unspoken bonds. The weeks seemed to blur together for Charlie. The weight of watching Ashley deteriorate slowly, the constant undercurrent of grief that hung in the air, and the quiet strength of her mother began to settle like a fog over his life. Yet there was also something that began to change in him. He couldn't pinpoint when it started, but over time, he realized that these small, seemingly inconsequential visits had become a lifeline for both him and Ashley's family. Charlie had always been a man of duty, focused on the task at hand, the next call, the next patrol. But now he found himself more emotionally invested in this neighborhood than ever before. It wasn't just the routine he had grown accustomed to. It was the people, particularly Ashley's family, who had woven their way into his heart in a way he never expected. One quiet afternoon, Charlie had just finished his shift and was making his usual way through the neighborhood when something in the air felt different. The sky was overcast, and the usual calm of the streets had been replaced by an almost tangible stillness. His heart had an uneasy flutter, a feeling of anticipation, or perhaps dread. When he reached the corner of Ashley's block, Charlie noticed something strange. The front door of the house was wide open. It was unusual for the Thompsons to leave their home unguarded. They were always careful, always attentive to Ashley's condition, and they knew how vulnerable they had become over the past few months. Charlie's instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. He parked the patrol car quickly and rushed toward the house, his heart thumping in his chest. He knocked on the door, calling out softly, "Mrs. Thompson, Ashley." There was no answer. His stomach churned with a mixture of fear and anxiety. Without thinking, Charlie pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the absence of sound. He moved cautiously through the hallway, past the familiar paintings on the walls, the family pictures that once filled the space with life. As he reached the living room, the silence was almost suffocating. But then he heard it, a soft, muffled sound from the kitchen. Charlie moved toward the sound, his breath catching as he entered the kitchen. There, sitting at the table, was Ashley's mother, her face pale and drawn, a look of helplessness in her eyes that Charlie had never seen before. She was staring at the phone in her hand, her fingers trembling. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she didn't jump or show surprise. She simply looked at him, as if she had been expecting him. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice strained. But she didn't need to say more. The exhaustion and grief that had been mounting for so long had finally broken through, and she dissolved into tears, her body racked with sobs. It was the kind of pain that went beyond words, the kind of hurt that no one could fully understand unless they had lived it. Charlie immediately moved to her side, his presence a steady force in the storm of emotion. He didn't speak at first, not knowing what to say. Instead, he placed a hand gently on her back, offering her what little comfort he could. He knew better than anyone that there were no words that could fix what was broken, no phrases that could heal the wounds of a mother watching her child suffer. "I don't know what to do," she said between sobs. "She's getting worse, Charlie. It's happening too fast. The doctors can't help anymore. I just want to hold on to her. I can't lose her. I don't know how to let go." Charlie's heart twisted in his chest as he listened to her words. He had always known how much Ashley's mother loved her daughter, but hearing her speak so openly about her fear of losing her only child left him breathless. He wanted to fix it, to make everything okay. But he knew that nothing could ease the crushing weight she was carrying. "There's nothing you can do," Charlie said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You've done everything for her, and she's fought so hard. There's no shame in not being able to fix this. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be there." She looked up at him then, her eyes red from crying, but there was a flicker of something else there, a sense of recognition, a small relief in knowing that someone truly understood the depth of her pain. "I don't want her to be scared," she whispered. "I don't want her to feel alone in this, but how can I protect her from something like this?" Charlie didn't have an answer. There was no simple solution to a pain this deep, but he could see that her greatest fear wasn't losing Ashley. It was watching her daughter face this battle alone. And that he could help with. "You're not alone," Charlie said firmly. "You're not alone in this, and neither is Ashley. You have me. You have people who care, and we're not going anywhere." As they sat together in the kitchen, Charlie found himself holding on to that promise as though it were the only thing that could keep the world from crumbling. He wasn't going to leave them. He wasn't going to let this family face their darkest days alone. The days that followed were filled with hospital visits, quiet moments in the house, and continued conversations about what was next. Charlie kept his promise. He stayed. Even as Ashley's condition continued to worsen, he remained a steady presence in their lives. He helped with whatever he could, whether it was running errands for her mother or simply sitting by Ashley's side during her moments of rest. Despite everything, Ashley's mother found strength in the little things, finding moments to laugh, to share stories about Ashley's younger years, to celebrate the girl's tenacity. The family may have been broken in ways that could never fully be mended, but they still had each other. And in a way, that was enough. Charlie's role had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just an officer patrolling the streets anymore. He was a friend, a confidant, and a silent witness to a family struggle. But as the days passed, Charlie realized that his presence, however small, was making a difference. He wasn't just there to help with the logistics. He was there to remind Ashley's family that they weren't alone. He was there to be a silent protector when no one else could do anything. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the weight of reality hung heavy in the air, Charlie found himself marveling at the strength he witnessed every day. Ashley's mother, though exhausted beyond measure, never faltered in her devotion to her daughter. She had found a way to survive in a world that seemed too cruel, too unfair. And as for Ashley, despite everything, there were moments when that spark of life would return, even if just for a brief second. Those moments were all they had, but to them, they were everything. Charlie often wondered if he would ever fully understand the depths of what they were going through. But in the end, he didn't need to. What mattered was that he was there. What mattered was that, in the face of unrelenting adversity, they had each other, and that somehow made everything a little bit more bearable. And so, Charlie continued to show up every day, not just as a police officer, but as someone who had become irrevocably entwined in the story of a family's love and loss. A new beginning. As the days grew longer and the seasons changed, so did the life that had once seemed completely defined by loss. The healing was slow, but it was happening. Charlie continued to patrol the streets, now with a renewed sense of purpose. The quiet moments of reflection in the midst of his duties were no longer just about the weight of what he couldn't change. They had become moments where he appreciated the importance of connection, of showing up for others, even when there were no guarantees of success or reward. Ashley's mother, despite the loss, had found a new rhythm in her life. The grief that had once threatened to consume her now became a part of her, something she carried with her, but not something that defined her entirely. She had found strength in helping others who were going through the same kind of pain, and that sense of purpose had allowed her to breathe a little easier. Charlie's visits, once filled with quiet sorrow, had become moments of healing, not just for her, but for him as well. One afternoon, Charlie pulled up to Ashley's house, noticing a small group of people sitting on the porch. His heart lifted when he recognized a few familiar faces. These were the parents, the families who had suffered the same kind of loss as Ashley's mother. She had started the support group, something she had never considered possible in her darkest moments. And now it was growing. They were finding strength in each other, in their shared pain, and in the understanding that, while they could never undo the past, they could move forward together. Charlie stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward the group. Ashley's mother was sitting at the center, surrounded by other parents, all of them engaged in quiet conversation. It was clear that something had shifted in her. Her face was still marked by sadness, but there was a gentleness to her now, a wisdom that had come from years of surviving the most unimaginable loss. "Hey, Charlie." She greeted him with a soft smile, her eyes tired but grateful. "Glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, offering her a nod of respect. "How's everything going here?" "It's going well," she said, motioning to the others. "We're sharing stories, offering support. It's a good thing, Charlie. It helps to have people who really understand what you're going through." Charlie felt a deep sense of admiration for her. She had turned her pain into something positive, something that could help others find a path through their own darkness. It was a kind of strength that he had never expected from her, yet it had emerged in the most unexpected way. He sat down beside her, joining the circle of people who had come together to heal. As the group shared their stories, Charlie listened, though he wasn't a part of the conversation. He was struck by how much healing had already begun in these individuals, how much strength they had drawn from each other, and how, little by little, they had begun to rebuild their lives. The grief would always be there, but it wasn't all that defined them anymore. It had become part of the tapestry of their lives, but it was no longer the center. As the evening wore on, Charlie realized that while the story of Ashley's family would never be free from sorrow, it was also a story of resilience, of love, loss, and most importantly, survival. Through all of it, they had found a way to move forward. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been fast. But it had happened. "I'm proud of you," Charlie said quietly to Ashley's mother as the group began to disperse. "I know it's not easy, but you've made a difference in so many lives already." Her eyes met his, full of gratitude, but also something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "I couldn't have done it without you, Charlie," she said softly. "You were there when I needed someone. You helped me keep going, even when I didn't think I could. That's something I'll never forget." Charlie nodded, but there was a lump in his throat. The simple truth was, he had been there for them because he couldn't imagine walking away. There was no easy way out, no way to fix everything, but being a presence in their lives, just showing up, had made all the difference. It was something he would carry with him for the rest of his career, and perhaps for the rest of his life. As the group slowly dispersed, Charlie stayed for a while longer, helping clean up and chatting with the remaining members of the support group. But as the evening began to draw to a close and the others left, Ashley's mother stayed behind to clean up the last of the chairs. Charlie watched her for a moment, sensing that she was ready to move on to the next chapter of her life. Though the journey had been long, she had finally found her footing again. She was, in many ways, starting over, not because she had forgotten Ashley, but because she had learned to carry her daughter's memory with her in a way that was both loving and empowering. "You've come a long way," Charlie said, standing next to her as they both looked out at the quiet street. She turned to him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "We both have," she said. "I never thought I'd make it through, but here I am. And I couldn't have done it without you." Charlie was about to say something else, but before he could, a small voice interrupted. "Charlie." He turned around, surprised to see a young woman standing at the edge of the yard. It was one of the other support group members. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she looked determined. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I've never met someone who truly understands. You helped me when I didn't even realize I needed help. I didn't think I'd ever be able to smile again, but you made me believe that there's still hope." Charlie felt his heart swell, though he wasn't quite sure how to respond. All he could do was nod, a simple acknowledgement that he was just one small part of their healing process. "You're welcome," he said softly. "You're stronger than you think." The young woman smiled, a real, genuine smile. It wasn't one of perfection, but it was one that said, "I'm surviving. I'm still here." As she left, Charlie turned back to Ashley's mother. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the evening sky. There was a kind of peace in that silence, an understanding that even after all the heartache, life had a way of moving forward. And in the quiet moments like these, when you least expected it, you could find a new beginning. "You did good," Charlie said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Ashley's mother nodded, looking out at the street that had seen so many tears, but also so much healing. "We did good," she corrected softly. "We all did." And in that moment, surrounded by the stillness of the night, Charlie knew that sometimes the most profound impact wasn't made by grand gestures or big speeches. It was in showing up, in staying, in walking alongside someone through the darkest moments of their life. The journey would never truly end, But it was enough to know that the road ahead was not one that had to be walked alone. And for the first time in a long time, Charlie felt peace settle in his heart. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from answers, but the kind that came from knowing that he had been there for someone when they needed it most. And that was all he needed to know.